Hello, in this video, I'll show you how JavaScript closures work. By the end of this video, you should be comfortable using closures in your JavaScript code. Let's begin now. Welcome back. Closures in JavaScript can be very confusing and sometimes frustrating to understand. So in this video, I'm going to simplify what closures are and make it easier for you to understand closures. On my desktop here, I have an app.js file opened and an index.html file that's linked up to this app.js. We are going to write the code here and test using live server on this instance here. So for you to understand closures, there are a number of principles that you need to know. One is function scope, then the static scope, or sometimes it's going to be called, you'll see, lexical scope. Then I guess this should be number 2, this should be number 3, this should be the second one. We should have the first as nesting functions. In JavaScript, it's possible to nest one function into another function. And once a function is nested into another function, the inner function will have access to the variables, or if you like, the properties of the outer function. Let me show you by example. Suppose we have a function here, we call it the outer function, and inside this function, the first variable that we declare, since this is the variable of this function, we'll call it the outer function variable or property. The variable can be something like name, give it a string. This variable belongs to this function, and if you understand scoping, we cannot access this variable outside this function. We are allowed to now do nesting of functions. The first principle here, we can create an inner function, we call it inner, and now this inner function has been nested inside this. This inner function can now use this variable. We can pass it here, then inside it, we can console log the message, then we add the name. At this point, we have not defined the message, or we need to define a message. In here, we can have another variable, let message be equal to something like hello. The intention of this function is to display a welcome message to a visitor, or maybe once someone is logged in. Then after we have completed this inner function, we need to now return for the outer function, create a return for the outer function. So here we need a return, and this return, we return the inner function. This is what we're going to return. We've nested these two functions, then this function has accessed this variable, which is the property of the outer function, and it can access this even after the outer function has already been executed. So now here we can now call the function by first of all creating a new constant. We can call this welcome message, which is a call to this outer function. We are somehow like instantiating the function. Then we can now use the welcome message function and pass in the name of the guest to this website or this application. And it gives us hello. So let's carefully look at what's happening in this function. We have an outer function. This outer function is nesting an inner function. Then this inner function has access to this variable. So it's picking this variable, then it's defining its own variable here. And this variable is being logged into the console along with the name of the person. We can add an empty string here, the old school way of doing things, instead of temporary literals to separate that. So alternatively, we would use temporary literals to console log this. But let's just go with that. We are accessing this name variable. Then we are defining another variable inside this function. So this outer function does not have access to this. Then after we close this function, we are returning this inner function. Then we call the functions outside and pass the variable, this variable, so that like can be logged on the console. So for a closure to work, you need to understand that the inner function has access to the variables of the outer function. So that's the simplest way to explain what closures are. One of the best use cases of closures to explain this concept and to see a practical example is, suppose we'd like this message to be delayed for a certain number of milliseconds before it's executed. So let me comment out this and create a new function that will use the set timeout function as an inner function. Here we do, this is a use case example of a closure. We begin by creating a function. This function will call it delay the message. That's the outer function. Then this outer function will take in a message parameter. Then it's also going to take the milliseconds. Then this variable or this parameter is equivalent to an outer function variable. And now if we come in here and nest a new function, it should access this parameter which belongs to the outer function. I'll do a set timeout function here. Then this needs to be close to the colon. So this is an inner function. We console log the message, which is this variable. Then we pass in the milliseconds to the set timeout function. You need to have a comment there for this to work. We are simply accessing this variable in here. This needs to have a semicolon. We have an inner function that's accessing the variable of the outer function. Outside here, we can now call the message delay. Then we pass in the message you would like. Then we pass in the number of milliseconds and save, and it's delaying for 1,000. I'd like to take this to 2,000 and 2,000. Let's make it 3,000 and it's 3,000. That's a typical use case of using a closure, and this is what we call callbacks. We have a callback function that we are using to explain this concept of closures. I hope by the end of this video, you now understand how to create and use closures in JavaScript. If you have further questions, kindly leave a comment in the section below or reach out to me using the link in the description. Thank you and see you in the next video.